What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again. It's the Thursday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the Global Catholic Radio Network, as I'm sure you know. But you know what? This program is a little bit different from everything else that you hear the other 23 hours of the day. This program is specifically for non-Catholics. So if you're listening to us and you are a former Catholic, fallen away Catholics, lazy Catholics, how's that? Someone who goes maybe to church once a year, twice a year, whenever they feel like it. I've certainly known a lot of people in that bag, and you know what? There may be a good reason why you're listening to this show today, and that is to find out more about the Catholic faith. Maybe there's something about the Catholic faith that bothers you, makes you angry, something that is sort of bewildering. Whatever that is, this program is here for you. Call now, 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. If you're calling from outside North America, we have a line just for you, the international line, and that is dialing country code 1 and then 205-271-2985. A lot of people like to text us these days. You can text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response and then text us your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. So that is the show. That is what we do. We've got Michael McCall as our producer today. Jeff Burson, I believe, I think he is handling social media. Fantastic. Rich Jesse is answering the phones. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Very impressed that you're wearing a tie 2 days in a row.
Well, yeah, we're having two conferences back-to-back in our diocese on the use of this media resource called Formed, which is a production of the Augustine Institute and Ignatius Press.
Apparently very hip.
And it's kind of like Netflix for Catholics. It's movies, books, podcasts, audio resources.
A one-stop shop.
Yeah, it's basically, I think they said this morning, if you added up the value of all the content, if you get a subscription to this, it's like $18,000 worth of content that you get for $10 a month.
Yeah.
It's just a tremendous amount of stuff. Anyway, we're promoting its use in the Birmingham Diocese, which that's my day job when I'm not on the radio.
Yeah.
Catechesis here. So I actually had to put a tie on to look good in front of a live audience.
You're a fine American. Well, we're going to take a quick email here before we get to the phones, and I thought this was fascinating. This is from Debbie. I don't see where Debbie is, but here's what the email says. Good morning, and thank you for all the wonderful work you do. I listen via YouTube every day. I would appreciate it if you could explain the difference between the Catholic belief about the Eucharist versus the Episcopalian belief. I have a friend who thinks we are all basically the same. She said in her church they also have a tabernacle where the Eucharist is reserved. Thanks very much. Pax et bonum, Debbie.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. So whenever you talk about Episcopalians, you really have to qualify it with which Episcopalians are you talking about. Because Episcopalians come in a lot of flavors. Well, Anglicans, I should say, come in a lot of flavors.
Okay.
There are some that see themselves as being almost Catholic. In fact, they'll use that language. And there's a group that calls themselves Anglo-Catholic.
Anglo-Catholic,
okay?
I have heard this.
And the Orthodox don't see it this way, but the Anglo-Catholics would, it's almost like they would see themselves as kind of the Western version of Orthodoxy. They would think that the only thing in their minds, the only thing they didn't share with the Catholic Church would be their view of the Pope, and almost everything else they would be Catholic in their doctrine. That's how they see themselves, as kind of a branch of that one great Christian tradition.
Okay.
That's not the way Catholics and Orthodox view Anglo-Catholics, but it's the way Anglo-Catholics describe themselves.
All right.
That's kind of, if you will, the sort of far right of Anglicanism. And then there's from there all the way over, to the far left of Anglicanism, groups that it's pretty much open season on whatever you want to believe. You know, I mean, and it's very hard to pin down on any sort of doctrinal content. And then everything in between. So classical Episcopalianism, Anglicanism of the 16th century, especially the Elizabethan era, formulated their official doctrines in 39 articles, or called the 39 articles. That's their doctrinal statement, that drew a lot from the Calvinist tradition. And so it would be more like sort of mainstream historic Protestantism. And so you kind of have to locate where are you on that continuum in order to talk about what Anglican belief in the Eucharist is.
Well, okay.
So let me tell you instead, rather than trying to generalize all of that, let me tell you what the Catholic position is on the Anglican Eucharist. Okay?
Okay.
In order to have a valid Eucharist, you have to have a validly ordained priesthood. A layman cannot consecrate the Eucharist.
Okay.
Only a validly ordained priest can. Okay? In the 16th century, when the Anglicans left the Church of Rome, under King Edward, they implemented a new ordinal, a new rite of ordination for priests, that denied the doctrine of the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist and the sacerdotal nature of the priesthood. That the priest's job is to offer sacrifice, namely the sacrifice of Holy Mass.
Sacerdotal.
Sacerdotal means priestly.
Okay.
You know, having that offering aspect of your job.
Okay.
They denied that, okay? And so that every ordination in the Anglican Church that was performed after the introduction of the Edwardine ordinal is invalid. So they lost apostolic succession, and they do not have a valid Eucharist.
Okay.
Okay? And that is an infallible teaching of the Roman Magisterium. So Leo XIII, in the encyclical Apostolicae Curiae, taught, I mean, Catholics must definitively hold that Anglican orders are invalid. They do not have a valid priesthood, and therefore they do not have a valid Eucharist. Okay? So even if an Anglican priest claimed to believe everything that the Catholic Church believed about the Eucharist,
yes,
they would still not have the same Eucharist because they don't have a valid priesthood, and therefore he might theoretically, I say might, have Orthodox belief in the Eucharist, but he wouldn't thereby have the actual sacrament.
Okay.
Now, most Anglican priests do not, in fact, have Catholic faith in the sacrament. Most of them don't. At least the ones that would affirm the 39 Articles would have something much more similar to, say, the Calvinist doctrine of the Eucharist. All right, and would deny, say, for example, the doctrine of transubstantiation. They might have some other more shadowy way of describing the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and they would not have such a realist conception of Eucharistic sacrifice.
Okay, very good. We hope that is helpful for you, and that was from Debbie. Debbie, thank you so much for your email. Coming up on 9 after the hour, and when we come back, we'll talk with Tony in El Dorado, Kansas, also Andrew in Houston. There are 2 lines open right now, 1-800-585-9396, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders about the Catholic faith. Again, this is mainly a program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, so if you'd like to tell us why you are not a Catholic, love to talk with you. 1-800-585-9396. 10 after the hour, this is Call to Communion on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-800-585-9396. This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
60 on 10 with Monsignor Charles Pope.
The first commandment, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no strange gods before me. In this commandment, God seeks to protect us from false claimants to our worship and obedience. And there's a great sad history of people who have trusted in gods other than Him or things other than Him, and the ruin that it has caused. So God is trying to protect us and call us to an absolute trust and obedience of Him. He asks us to trust Him above all things and above all other people or so-called gods. We have to also avoid things like consulting horoscopes, palm reading, clairvoyance, recourse to mediums, any desire to try to control things apart from God. God simply says, trust me, I'm the Lord your God. I am the first commandment. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no strange gods before me.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
It's time for your favorite EWTN program, but there's no radio? No problem. Download the EWTN app at EWTN.com/mobile and enjoy on-demand live streams of your favorite EWTN radio and TV shows right now.
In honor of our beloved foundress, EWTN has now released a second set of programs commemorating her entrance into eternity. In Memoriam, Mother Mary Angelica, a brand new 4-disc treasury that you'll cherish for years to come. Available now from EWTN Religious Catalog. Relive remarkable memories, heartfelt recollections, and laugh-out-loud anecdotes from friends, family, and even Mother herself.
I believe the network was created by God to teach the person in the living room, the person in the pew, how to live in a nitty-gritty, gutsy world.
Memorable moments from an unforgettable life. Make room on your video shelf today for In Memoriam, Mother Mary Angelica. Special live shows and short programs. Available now at EWTNRC.com.
This is Bishop John Brungart of the Diocese of Dodge City.
This is Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology.
This is Father Larry Richards, host of Open Line Thursday. Thanks for listening to EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
Welcome back, 13 after the hour. This is indeed Call to Communion here on EWTN. Got a couple of texts that are coming in right now. If you would like to text us, because sometimes that's a good way to get in when the phones are kind of sold out here. That would be the letters EWTN. Just text the letters EWTN to 55000. Let's get to one of these before we go to the phones. Diana from Ohio says, Protestant relatives who love this concept of depravity of the soul. Person stated that every cell in our body shows this depravity. How can I biblically defend the Catholic position? Thanks so much, Dr. Anders.
Okay, thanks. So the Protestant doctrine of total depravity is the view that original sin is like an infection that pervades the soul and taints everything that we do, so that even our righteous deeds, even our good deeds, are so vitiated that they are objectively hateful to God, even with grace. That's the Protestant doctrine of total depravity.
Wow.
So that in say Luther or Calvin schema, when God looks at Mother Teresa of Calcutta, if he were to just look at her objectively, okay, without the filter of Christ's righteousness being imputed, if God were to just look objectively, this Protestant view, not the Catholic view,
right,
then he would hate her, and justice would demand her eternal, everlasting punishment while she's pulling beggars out of the gutter.
Yeah.
That's the Calvinist Lutheran view. All right, so that her only hope of salvation is that God doesn't do that, and in fact treats her as if she were righteous, when in fact she's just noxiously horrible. All right, that's the Protestant doctrine of the imputation of Christ's righteousness. And it's connected to their view of the atonement, namely that God punishes an innocent person, Jesus, so that he can acquit a noxiously guilty person, Mother Teresa. That's the Protestant view. All right. Now, Luther himself understood that this understanding of sin, of depravity, and how it's connected to the Protestant understanding of salvation and the atonement, he understood that this was objectively absurd. He understood that. That it was offensive to reason. Okay? And it is offensive to reason, because what it says is that God punishes the innocent and acquits the guilty. That's what we call injustice. If a judge does that, he's unjust.
Right.
Luther got that. He addressed it in numerous places, but the one that sticks in my mind the most clearly was in 1525 in his treatise on the bondage of the will. And he says, doesn't this make God unjust? And he would say, well, it would seem so, and all that shows is that human reason is unreliable. So he became, in order to affirm this, he had to become an irrationalist. Okay, he had to.
I'm right. Everybody else has got it totally
wrong. No, more than that. Reason itself is the enemy of faith, which he said explicitly in his disputation against scholastic theology. This was 1519. Luther says reason is the worst enemy of faith. He had nasty language that he used to describe what reason was in comparison to faith. So he had his view of the relationship of faith and reason is that there's no coherence between the two. And you just have to you just chunk reason and you just go with fideism, which is the faith says it because I, Luther, say so, and that's the truth, and that's all it is. In that respect, he's very similar to the to the medieval Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali, who said the same thing. He said, reason doesn't tell you about God, only Sharia does. So Luther and medieval Islam are similar in that respect, just utter divorce of faith and reason.
Wow.
Right? The Catholic position is that reason actually can attain to real truth, metaphysical truth about the nature of the causation and the origin of the world, can also attain real ethical and moral truth. Right? In other words, morality is essentially the science of human flourishing. What is it that makes a rational soul truly blessed or happy? That's the way Christ frames his moral teaching. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those, and so forth.
Yeah.
And Christ directs us to our true good in God and the love of neighbor, right? And that these things, the Catholic Church says, can also, to a certain extent, rationally accessible, all right? You look at a guy like Aristotle, who didn't know anything about the Catholic faith at all, but he had a lot of good sense about what a good moral life would look like, all right? And that there are objective goods like justice or truth, fortitude, magnanimity, and these things can be known reasonably to be good. Okay, and God created the natural world, and said of the natural world, it is good. All right. Now, the presence of sin in the world does not destroy, utterly vitiate natural goodness, and that's something that is accessible. Yes, Revelation teaches that, but so does reason.
Sure.
You know, it forces you into one of two positions. You either have to take the utterly absurd point of view that to tend for lepers and to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and educate the uninstructed and to work for peace and order in society and the betterment of all men and brotherhood and kindness and all that. That's either objectively good or nothing can be known objectively. All right, and so the Protestant doctrine of total depravity leads you ultimately into the kind of divorce of faith and reason that makes it impossible for us to know anything.
Wow. Okay. So that should be helpful for Diana.
I hope so.
Yeah.
But, if I were to quote one scripture verse,
okay,
and God said it was good.
Love that.
Okay.
Diana, we hope that is helpful for you. Let's go to the phones right now and talk with Andrew in Houston, listening to EWTN on Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Andrew, what's your question today?
Hey, how's it going? My question is, I have my brother, like a lot of friends, are used to be Catholics, atheists, or evangelicals, or some, very few, go to Joe Austin. But I guess my question is, with the new Pope, I think, which is a good thing, I think they're trying to change the message, not the doctrine, but the message of the Catholic Church. Because if you go to Spanish Mass compared to English Mass, it's like night and day what the priest is saying. It's very judgmental in English Mass. In Spanish Mass, you might even have gang members, drug addicts, or whatever, all walks of life, because there's only one church in Latin America. And I think what the Catholic Church, I want to hear your take on it. Do you think it's trying to change the message? Because there's a huge falling away of Catholicism, especially in the States.
Okay, I appreciate the question a lot. And you're raising a profound question that's very, very complex, and I can't do justice to it in the 2 or 3 minutes that I'm going to have to spend out on this radio call. But I have studied the dynamics of religious adherence. Okay, what draws people to a religious tradition, what retains them within a religious tradition, what causes them to depart from a religious tradition, not just within Catholicism, but across the human religious landscape. I've read about this sociologically and historically, and one thing that I think is a constant, okay, across, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, Mormons, whatever it is, that people don't join religious groups because they're looking for something that exactly maps onto their secular experience. All right. That people join religious groups because they have this powerful intuition of the sacred, of the transcendent. And so it's incredibly important in any evangelistic appeal to lead with your strong suit, to present the faith as a message of transcendent meaning. Now, I think it's also extremely important that it be presented in a consistent way, like across the catechetical culture of the community. Obviously, if you walk into a community and you've got everybody saying something different, that strains credibility and the authority of the tradition. Okay, and there's some conviction there that comes along with it. And what you find, and this is not just true for Catholics. I mean, you could start almost any religion, really, to be honest with you, and if the adherents believe it forcefully and proclaim it a message of transcendent meaning with a certain amount of affability among the members and a certain level of consistency, it'll adhere. It'll win converts, and they'll be retained. All right. There are a lot of studies. The number one strongest predictor of religious participation and a healthy, vibrant religious life is lifelong exposure to catechetical ministry or religious education. Okay, so when I look at some of the dynamics that have affected Catholic growth or the loss of members in the Catholic Church, especially in the West, not so much in Africa, okay, where the faith is growing tremendously.
Yeah,
I think that there was a kind of dissolution in the catechetical ministry of the Church in North America. I don't see that North American Catholicism in the last 50 years has been overrun with harsh, authoritarian judgmentalism. In fact, I think my surveys of Catholic life and practice that I've studied extensively lead me to the opposite conclusion, that catechesis in the North American Church has tended much more towards sort of latitudinarian, broad-minded progressivism and a kind of leveling of differences in kind of the attitudes about the differences between Catholics and the non-Catholic world. Prior to the Council, I think there was a very well-developed sense in the Catholic mind in North America that we're Catholics and we're not those guys. And I think that's been kind of diminished to a certain extent. And the numbers demonstrate that the more you kind of elide the difference between your tradition and the other guy, the less motive a person has to stay in his tradition. And when I study those people who have come to the faith, it's because they've been enculturated into this broad, deep, rich Catholic tradition, and they find something there that was lacking, that wasn't present in their other tradition. All right, and leading with that, leading with the depth and the richness of the tradition, which includes a commitment to objective moral norms. All right, I don't think it's harsh or authoritarian to say of the Church that she teaches objective moral norms. I think that is absolutely liberating to the human spirit, because the objectively good is what's objectively normative. We to love God, to know the truth, to live in freedom from internal conflict, love, the love of neighbor and friendship. These are objective moral values that guide our life. And I think the more we lead with those in the Catholic Church, the more people come to the Church and are attracted to it. There's nothing offensive about truth. Truth is always liberating.
Always. Appreciate your call, Andrew. 24 after the hour. Glad you could join us here for the Thursday edition of Call to Communion on EWTN. Let's go now to Tony in El Dorado, Kansas, listening to us on AM 1360. Tony, what's your question today?
Well, my question is about, what is the Church's view on premarital sex between people that have already been married?
Sure. Thanks. I really appreciate that. So, sex outside of marriage is the sin of fornication. All right, and St. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7. Specifically, he talks exactly about the situation you're mentioning. What do you do with unmarried people who've never been married? What do you do with people who are married? What do you do with people who are married and widowed? He didn't have in mind divorce, but a similar situation there.
Okay.
And it's pretty clear from St. Paul's text that there's only one option, and that is marital sexuality. Jesus addresses the same topic, of course, in Matthew 19, talks about the proper context for human sexuality. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 2353, identifies the sin of fornication as carnal union between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman. And that's true whether the people have been married or not, whether they're divorced or not. So why is fornication such a grave sin? It is a grave sin. It's one of those mortal sins that can separate us from the love of God and will damn us to hell if we do it unrepentantly. Why is fornication that bad? Well, think about it. There's a world of difference between saying, I'd like to have sex with you, but I will not live with you, will not raise a family with you, and will not pledge my fidelity to you until death. And I would like to pledge my fidelity with you until death for the sake of raising a family and lay down my life to bring you to heaven. And in that context, sexuality will take on a transcendent dimension as we seek to raise children together and to make a total self-offering of ourselves to one another, body and soul, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven.
Big difference.
Those two relationships are radically different.
Yeah.
Even though the physical act is the same, the quality of the act, the form of the act, as it comes from my intent, which is the center of my spiritual person, is a very different kind of act. One of them is a transcendent gift of oneself for the sake of a noble end, and one of them is an essentially selfish act of taking, or maybe a mutual exploitation for a time until it suits us to do otherwise. Very different kinds of acts.
Absolutely. Tony, thank you so much for your call. In just a moment here, we'll be talking with Barbie in San Angelo, Texas. Also, Joan, who is driving across Iowa. Randy in Alberta, Canada. and a very powerful text from John. I'm going to get to that right after the break here. It's called to Communion here on EWTN. We've got 2 open lines at the moment, 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. Call to Communion on EWTN.
From EWTN News Nightly in Washington, D.C., I'm Wyatt Goolsby with an EWTN News Link. Donald Trump faces criticism after he refuses to say if he would accept the election outcome. But pro-life Americans are applauding Trump for describing the horrors of partial birth abortion. Hillary Clinton says she supports abortion rights and would appoint Supreme Court justices who share that view. People from all over the world gathered to watch the third and final presidential debate. Hundreds followed it in Mexico City, where the issue of immigration is at the forefront. And U.S. Ambassador Caroline Kennedy called on Japanese students to monitor the historic election. Russia announces a pause in airstrikes near Aleppo, Syria, so that humanitarian groups can help civilians. The Syrian military has called on residents in the rebel-held districts to evacuate. Tears of joy in Nigeria. 21 Chibok schoolgirls are reunited with their families after more than 2 years in Boko Haram captivity. Today they met with the Nigerian president, who signed off on that deal that secured their release.
Hi, this is Doug Keck, and this is an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I just finished interviewing Father Robert Spitzer about his book, God So Loved the World. Father, give us a synopsis of what the book's about.
Well, the book is the third in a quartet of books. This one's called God So Loved the World. It's about the reality of Jesus, and we're in desperate need of an updated Christian apologetic. And, C.S. Lewis, of course, was a true master, but much of his apologetic can be so updated by today's standards. So this book is attempting to really update so much in Christian apologetics that's come to light.
Okay, that's the book is God So Loved the World. The author is Father Robert Spitzer, and this has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief. Check out the book, EWTNRC.com. You can buy it there. Thank you for joining us.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
Great radio here on EWTN 24/7, including our very next program, EWTN Open Line Thursday, wherein Father Larry Richards answers your questions on the new evangelization. We call him the 60-second man, because he just goes through calls, boom, 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 boom. It's fascinating. And yet, people just love him because he just cuts right to the meat of it and really gets an awful lot of people the questions that they want answered. I think it's fantastic. So join Father Larry in about 30 minutes from now on most of these EWTN radio stations. Before we go back to the phones, I want to get to this text from John, and I think this is very important. He says, how are Catholics to view the over 100 verses in the Quran commanding Muslims to jihad or holy war against infidels, people like us, in light of calls by certain Catholic bishops to ecumenism and Catholic Islamic cooperation? As a Maronite, as well as an Assyrian and a Chaldean, I find such cooperation with a people who has caused my own people so much pain difficult.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. It's one I've given a lot of thought to.
Yeah.
Now, I think that there is a common fallacy, not just Catholics, but all people, all rational people make this when generalizing about religious traditions, okay? And it is the fallacy of essentialism or reification, where you take something that is a diverse phenomena, all right, and there is no sort of core or center of intellectual gravity in this tradition, and you say, well, all right, the essential content of this tradition is X, and then you rule out of the definition everything that doesn't fall into that essential content.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so for instance, we could do this with any tradition. If I say, I might say, well, the essential content of Buddhism is belief in the Tipitaka, which is the Buddhist scriptures from Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And that's what I mean by Buddhism. Well, if I do that, then I've just ruled out the entire Mahayana tradition that doesn't regard the Tipitaka but still claims the title of Buddhist. All right,
Okay.
you can slice up any historical tradition like this and trying to essentialize it and say, well, real Buddhists hold to this. Well, it ends up kind of straining credibility because there's always an exception. There's always somebody that falls outside your essentialist definition. All right, and I think it's better to treat religious traditions just as historical phenomena that change and shift and mold over time, and so that whether you're talking about Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism, ultimately the best way to frame it is simply Buddhism is whatever the Buddhist in front of me says it is. All right, and if he tells me my religious faith is that whatever, the earth is flat and the moon's made out of green cheese, if that's what Buddhism means to him, well, then who am I to say you're not a real Buddhist? That's what Buddhism means to him. And somebody else, it means adherence to the Tipitaka. And somebody else, it means, well, I hold to the Lotus Sutra. And somebody else, it means something entirely different. All right. Same thing with Islam. All right. Islam is a very old and diverse tradition with lots of different strains. Now, and there are a lot of people that claim this label. Now, if the guy standing in front of me says, you know what, to me, Islam means I'm going to cut your head off. Well, I'm not going to tell him that's not real Islam. That's what it means to him.
Yeah.
All right? And somebody else tells me, hey, Islam means we're going to, get together and sing Kumbaya in front of the fire and like toast each other. I mean, if that's what it means to him, that's what it means to him. I'm not going to tell him he's not a real Muslim. That's not my job. And in other words, I think the whole idea of trying to differentiate, well, he's a real Muslim and he's not a real Muslim, I think that's a fruitless enterprise, right? Because it's an arbitrary definition. If I come up with an arbitrary definition and say, you're a real Muslim, and Muslims themselves can't agree on what a real Muslim is. That's why there's been so much inter-Islamic conflict over the centuries. They have varying definitions of what counts as a real Muslim. All right, Catholicism is a bit of an advantage here because we all acknowledge we have a central authority, the papacy, the magisterium of the church, that does get to define what a real Catholic is and what somebody who's not a real Catholic is. We have a principled way of answering that distinction, but a lot of religious traditions don't. All right, so there's no doubt that there are historical expressions of Islam that are prevalent and widespread and very numerous and extremely influential that take a view of the religion that's really militaristic and hostile to Christendom. I mean, that's why there's been 1,000 years of warfare between Christendom and the Arabic and Islamic world. I mean, that's borne out in real bloodshed. That's very problematic.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I know Muslims in the modern world who repudiate that tradition and have a different understanding.
So
now,
do I.
what I think is mistaken is to get into this whole business about, well, who's a real Muslim or who's an authentic Muslim. I think that's a methodologically flawed way of analyzing the reality. All right, because you end up dismissing huge bodies of people that disagree with whatever your essentialist definition is. All right, and so whether you're a bishop or not, I think to say, well, these people are real Muslims and these people are fanatics, I think that can sometimes obscure rather than illuminate. It's better to say, look, here's a group of people that I like. Here's a group of people that want to cut my head off. I don't want to deal with the people cutting my head off, and I'd like to make common cause with the people that want to work with me. Is that helpful?
Hopefully so. John, we hope that is helpful for you as well. Appreciate your text. 35 after the hour. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's get to Barbie in San Angelo, Texas, listening to us on Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Barbie, what's your question today?
Hi. Yes, it's regarding abortion. Of course, as Catholics, we do not believe in abortion. We think that is morally wrong.
Correct.
But I'm asking, my question is, if I'm pregnant and the doctor comes and says, okay, it's either you or the child. If you deliver this child, there's possibly you can pass, you can die. So you have a choice, either abort your child or take the chance and Mom, you may pass. What is the Catholic faith? What does the Church say?
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, what does St. Gianna Molla say?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of distinctions we need to raise, okay? There are a couple of ethical theories out there, all right, good ones and bad ones. Consequentialism is a theory that was definitively rejected by Pope John Paul II in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor. Right? Consequentialism is the doctrine that I can do anything, I can justify any action, provided it has sufficiently good consequences. Okay?
Okay.
And that's wrong. That is incorrect. We cannot do good. Back up. We cannot do evil so that good will result.
Okay.
All right? That's consequentialism. I can do something evil as long as I get a good result. All right? That's wrong. All right? The flip side is the principle of the double effect. I can intend a good even if sometimes an evil that I don't intend is attendant to it, right, that follows from it. So let me give you an example.
Please.
Nothing wrong with buying a house.
Okay.
Buying a house, good thing. Put my family in it, raise my family, good house.
There you go.
Okay? When I buy a house, it would seem that I am implicitly or tacitly sanctioning the seizure of land from the Indians. Right? I had this argument was made to me by a theology professor in college one time. I thought it was illustrative. Okay?
All right.
Well, I'm not doing any such thing. I don't believe in the seizure of land from the Indians. Indians are good folks. I don't want to take their land. All right? But my great-great-great-great ancestors did. Well, am I complicit in that to some extent? Well, no, I'm not actually guilty of it, but wouldn't it seem that my action has this ancillary effect? Well, I don't intend that as an ancillary effect. All right? What I intend is to buy a house and raise my family. All right? But it may have all kinds of ancillary effects spilling out of that that may have negative consequences. So I go invest my money in a bank. The bank in turn may run around and, buy a foreign government bond, and the foreign government may turn around and buy arms and may turn around and sell them to terrorists, and, on down the chain of reasoning, someplace my putting the money in the bank contributed in a very remote way, to the bombing of a village in the third world. All right? I didn't intend that outcome, but it's somehow connected to my action of investing the money.
And that's double effect?
That's the principle of double effect.
Okay.
And provided the circumstances are appropriate and the effects are proportionate, it is lawful to do a good thing that may have an unintended negative consequence. It is never lawful to do an evil thing because I intend to bring about a good consequence. All right. So the principle here is that we have to preserve the life of the mother and the life of the child. Sometimes I may have to do something. I have to choose. Right. I can't have both. All right.
Right.
And I may have to perform a procedure to save the life of the mother, and I do not intend the death of the child as a means to that end, but the death of the child might occur.
Okay.
All right. That's different from positively intending the death of the child in order to save the mother.
Okay.
All right. And of course, which is the prudentially the most beneficial outcome? I mean, that you got to get into some hairy moral theology, and you got to look at the specific circumstances. But you can't positively intend the death of the child in order to do good to the mother. That's ruled out.
Okay.
That's consequentialism.
Appreciate your call, Barbie. Let's go to Joan, driving across Iowa, listening to us on Siouxland Catholic Radio. Joan, what's your question today? Hey, Joan. Hi, Joan.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you said Joe.
No.
Yes, my question is, I am a Protestant, and in Protestant circles, I heard a rumor that the Pope is planning on coming to Sweden on Reformation Day this year to make some sort of declaration regarding the Reformation no longer necessary because of Catholicism and, in this case, because it's Sweden, Lutheranism being connected in some way. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that. Is that just a rumor? Is that really happening?
Okay, a couple things. I appreciate the question. First of all, I haven't studied a lot about the Pope's planned trip to Sweden. I know he intends to go to Sweden for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And from what I know so far and what I know about Pope Francis is not interested in polemics, and he's not interested in picking fights. He's interested in building bridges. He's made that clear over and over and over again. So what I thoroughly expect, though I don't have the text of his speech in front of me, obviously, what I thoroughly expect is for Francis to go and celebrate all the things that Lutherans and Catholics have in common. All right, and he'll probably use some pretty strong language to stress those commonalities. Okay.
Okay.
Now, so I don't know precisely what he's going to say, but I will say this. All right, that the Council of Trent, which was an ecumenical council in the 16th century, and it was called in response specifically to the challenge of the Protestant Reformation, made certain dogmatic pronouncements about the interpretation of the Catholic faith that are infallible. All right. Now, infallible means it can't be mistaken. All right. Now, if I discover something, a theorem in geometry or arithmetic, for example, all right, I can't suddenly declare that to be untrue because it becomes like politically incorrect. Okay. You know, Pythagoras, the famous mathematician, there were Pythagoreans that followed him, that their religion basically involved more or less the worship of numbers, and they thought that everything could be expressed as a ratio. Right? That was part of their metaphysics. They thought everything in the reality could be expressed as a ratio, so they were just in love with geometry. Well, according to legend, the man that discovered irrational numbers, they murdered him.
Wow.
Right, because he found something in mathematics that didn't conform to their dogma on ratios, and so they killed him. He was a heretic.
It was an irrational thing to do.
Right, exactly. All right. My point is, though, that once you discover that, you just can't go. You can't do what the Pythagoreans say. You know, if something is infallibly true, it's infallibly true. You can't just change it because it becomes politically incorrect. Okay. Yeah. So the Council of Trent taught things about the nature of salvation, Scripture, the moral life, the sacraments that are infallibly true, and therefore the Catholic Church is not it's not a popularity club, and not a pope, not a bishop, not a theologian can come by and declare that something that's objectively and infallibly true is suddenly now not true. All right. And so whatever the Pope says, and I don't know what he's going to say, and however the media spins it, all right, the Council of Trent remains the dogmatic teaching of the Catholic Church, and everything that the Council said about the nature of justification, salvation, and the moral life is true because God has revealed it.
Yeah. I would, Joan, thank you so much for your call, and I would recommend staying close by to EWTN and to the Vatican website, vatican.va, because we're going to be all over this, especially on the TV side of EWTN when the Pope does go to Sweden. 43 after the hour. Speaking of EWTN, and I like to do that because I love EWTN, and a very important part of what we do is tied up in EWTN Religious Catalog. This is a division of EWTN that was started by Mother Angelica some years ago. I think it was in the mid-'90s, as I recall, to provide holy reminders for people, items that will help them grow closer to their faith, closer to Jesus. It's really a wonderful online destination for Catholic books, Catholic DVDs, rosaries, devotionals, pictures, statues, lots more. And the very cool thing about this, I think, every purchase directly supports EWTN's mission. Helps to pay for my salary, for you, David, for Michael. Everybody here is benefiting by the very good work of EWTN Religious Catalog. So if you're ready to shop, as you're thinking about where to go to shop, do consider EWTNRC.com. It is a wonderful, wonderful division of EWTN. Again, that's EWTNRC.com. Let's get back to the phones here at 45 after the hour. Andrew in Denver, listening to EWTN on Denver Catholic Radio. Andrew, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Kind of a continuation of a previous caller that was mentioning the difference between the Spanish Mass and English Mass.
Uh-huh.
And he seemed to be suggesting that the English Masses in America the faith was waning. And I was just started thinking about that. I'm wondering if that's the style of the Mass that's changed since Vatican II. And it also seems to me, I've been kind of just noticing things since I was a child, I'm in my 50s now, that Catholics seem to really welcome people into the faith if they're Protestant and from wherever, but they don't extend the olive branch to former Catholics and traditional Catholics. Are you aware of any efforts to welcome them back into the faith and extend an olive branch and welcome them into communion for traditional Catholics?
Okay, when you're talking about welcoming fallen away in tradition, are you talking about schismatic groups that have left the church, left full communion with the church, and gone off and formed breakaway pseudo-Catholic churches? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I wouldn't consider them schismatic. Maybe you do, but people that to answer your question, yes. I just don't. I object to that word schismatic, though.
Well, it's a very it's a very traditional word. So, I mean, the fact that there can be schisms in the church, that there can be objective divisions where one body refuses the juridical authority of the church. I mean, there's nothing more traditional than the concept of schism. So I don't know why that would be objectionable to you. Clearly the Donatists were in schism in North Africa. There's no question about that. But anyway, yeah, absolutely. There's a department of the Vatican whose sole task is to reconcile, for instance, members of the Society of St. Pius X. Absolutely. And I mean, that, I think more than any other traditionalist group, the SSPX has generated probably disproportionately large amounts of interest on the part of the Vatican, including Pope Francis, who just recently met with the ordinary for the society.
That's right.
Just within the last month. And that's been a perennial source of concern for the hierarchy. Here in the Diocese of Birmingham, there was a traditionalist monastery in the north of the state that left after the council, and they were recently reconciled within the last 5 years. So, yeah, there's efforts all over the place for that, all over the place.
Is that helpful for you, Andrew?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your call. It's 47 after the hour. This is Call to Communion on EWTN Radio. I want to get to another text here. This is interesting from Bill. When was Jesus first called the Christ?
Well, that's okay. So the texts of Scripture refer to him this way. St. Peter, of course, in his profession of faith in Matthew 16 says, Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And I'm trying to think. I mean, off the top of my head, there are multiple attestations in the Scriptures. And he applies, of course, to himself a number of messianic titles, such as Son of Man. That was one of Jesus's favorite self-appellations, which clearly has messianic overtones. And then Jesus applied to himself when the inauguration of his ministry. We read about it in the synagogue in Capernaum in the Gospel of Luke, when he picks up the text of the scroll of Isaiah and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me; He's anointed me to preach good news to the poor," and so forth. And then turns to the people and says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." He's not using the term the Christ, but he's clearly taking up the messianic mantle here, identifying this with his own ministry. Gospel of Mark, of course, earliest gospel, chapter 1, Christ says, the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God was the messianic kingdom. And of course, John the Baptist, even before the ministry of Christ began, indicated Jesus and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." I'm just kind of running through the text in my mind. But St. Peter's affirmation was clearly the most significant, I think, when he said, "Who do men say that I am? And who do you say?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
There it is. Appreciate that. Here's a quickie from YouTube. Daniel in Marion, North Carolina. Hey, Daniel. He wants to know, why do Eastern Catholic churches use leavened bread for the Eucharist when Jesus himself used unleavened bread? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a very old tradition, and it's just the way the rite developed in the eastern and western halves of the empire.
Okay.
There's theological discussions, but ultimately this is just it's a custom.
Okay, very good. Greg in Atlanta is listening to us right now on Ablaze Radio. Greg, what's your question today?
Yes, I'm a geologist out of Atlanta. I've been drilling hundreds and thousands of feet into the earth for over 25 years. I also am a believer, and I wanted to know what you thought the church's views were on the creation of the earth, the 6 days, and then rest on the seventh, versus science, which indicates 4.5 billion years old.
Okay, sure, thanks. I really appreciate that. So there's good magisterial teaching on these questions, particularly as they pertain to the origin of the human person, all right? Because that's where the rubber really hits the road.
Yeah.
And Pius XII published an encyclical called Humani Generis, specifically on the origin of the human person, and he discussed the Genesis narrative in light of what we know from natural science, anthropology, Darwinian evolution, and the like. And he spelled out, here's what Catholics are bound to believe, and here's what they are, where they're free to sort of speculate and wonder. And really what the Church insists is that we believe in the specific creation of the first man and woman, and the infusion of the immortal soul into them, Adam and Eve, if you will. But it does not preclude belief that God created the first human couple from pre-Adam Adamite, if you will, organic, living, biologic material. So you could hypothesize, for instance, a long period of biological evolution leading up to something very much like the first human couple, into which God infused the immortal soul. Now, interestingly, anthropology could never prove the doctrine of the special creation of the human soul and the human person, but it can come alongside in a corroborating sort of way. Anthropologists talk about the cognitive explosion that took place, or the cognitive revolution, I think is the term they use, that took place, after the African Exodus or whenever it was, when you have all these humanoid species and evidence for their transmigration around the globe, but not evidence of tool making and language use and picture drawing and that kind of thing. And all of a sudden, boom, out of nowhere comes this cognitive revolution. But in terms of the age of the earth, if you go back and read the church fathers on the book of Genesis, it's very clear none of them read this as a sort of literal, straightforward historical discussion of a scientific account of the origin of the physical universe. St. Augustine, in particular, in his book on the literal meaning of Genesis, well, the conclusion of that book is don't take it literally. Something else I was going to say just went right out of my head.
That's okay.
But the Catholic Church is the reason why there is a modern scientific method. Right? The reason there was a scientific revolution, the reason it evolved in the Latin Catholic West and no place else in the world, and was stillborn in every other culture that developed a technology, is specifically because of the view of faith and reason, the rational intelligibility of the world, the contingency of the world that was the intellectual patrimony of the Catholic tradition. There is never any conflict between science and the Catholic faith. There are sometimes metaphysical overreaching, right? When people mistake the scientific method for a metaphysics and think that all of reality can be squeezed inside the quantifiable empirical methods of science, when there's a lot more to reality than just what we can define quantitatively. But in terms of reading the text of Scripture in a sort of literal way like that, no, you're absolutely not compelled to do that.
Don't let that hang you up then, Greg. Thank you so much for your call. Are you ready for a lightning round text?
I don't know.
Something that you can answer in 30 seconds.
Let's give it a shot.
From Anna. Why is Jesus called the King of the Jews when he isn't the King of the Jews?
But he is.
But Anna says that he isn't.
Well, how does she know that? I mean, Christ is the King of the Jews. He acknowledged that he was the King of the Jews. And in 2 Samuel 14, God promised that David would never lack an heir on the throne of Israel. Well, Christ is either who he said he was and the King of the Jews, or else God's a liar. Because there ain't a king in physical Jerusalem today reigning in David's line. But there is one reigning over the entire cosmos, and that's King Jesus.
Well, there you go. I love the lightning round. It's awesome.
There we go.
Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom.
Appreciate this. I want to also thank Rich Jesse, Jeff Burson, and our wonderful Michael McCall for doing a super job behind the board. I'm Tom Price. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Call to Communion. Have a great day. God bless.